interview you are about to see is a virtual hangout that took place between myself and Mike Soldano recently, and we talk about Eddie Van Halen's involvement with playing S-Low 100s and how that came to be. We also talk about the early days of the Soldano amp company as a whole, his early days in Los Angeles, and what he is up to now, and everything in between. Shout out to Mike for taking the time to hang out with me. He's a lot of fun. I have such a great time hanging out with him every time we get to interact in any way, and it is an honor to talk to the man himself. So without further ado, here is the hang with myself and Mike Soldano. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I'm here with the, do you not like being called things like legendary or,
I don't. You can call me anything you want to. I really don't care.
The homie himself, Mike Soldano, is joining me today, and I thought we would hang out, and which is kind of ironic because we actually live quite close to each other. I think you're like just a couple of miles away from me. I'm over by Cheney Stadium in Tacoma.
Oh, we're really close. Oh my God. Yeah, we're actually just a few miles apart, literally.
That's so funny.
That's funny.
But I thought we would talk about, so with the recent untimely passing of Edward Van Halen, you actually played a huge role in a lot of those album tones in the Hagar years in the mid to late 80s, going into the 90s. And those are some of his most celebrated tones. But also, I was personally seeing a couple of old photos of him at his 5150 studios. And he has a couple of Soldanos. And I don't know anything about how he started playing those amps or your interaction with him, because I know you were in LA for a while, but I guess we should start with where you were when you first came into contact with the Van Halen camp or Eddie or whatever. Your shop was down in California, was it not?
Yes. So I had a little shop, and I mean, when I say little, I mean little. It's like 780 square feet, and I lived in it as well. And it was down on Melrose Avenue, not the trendy part of Melrose. It was way out on the more east end, out about, I think, between Kwanga and Vine. So it was
okay.
That in the late 80s, that was still not a very nice part of Melrose. I don't know what it's like nowadays, but it was really a sucky part back then. Anyhow, little tiny shop. And so that's where I was, just building amps, and had a little 12 by 12 foot workshop space and another little 12 by 12 place to show people amps and, kind of demo stuff. And then I lived in the back, and it worked out pretty good. So anyway, I don't exactly know how Ed ever even found out about my amps, but here's the story's hilarious. So it's Valentine's Day 1990. It's about, I don't know, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe 4:30 even. And I get a phone call, and it's Eddie Van Halen. He's like, hey man, Mike Soldano, I heard about these amps you're building. I really want to check one out. And I said, well, cool. Yeah, come on down tomorrow. I'll give you my address, love to show you an amp. He goes, no, I want to try one right now. And I'm like, well, I got to get out of here because I've got a date tonight. My girlfriend set up this evening, and it's Valentine's Day, and I'm supposed to meet her down in Sunset at the Chateau Marmont, and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, oh, no worries, I can be down there really quick. And I'm thinking like, yeah, it's LA, it's 4 o'clock, and the traffic has got to be insane, right?
Right.
And he's like, no, please just wait. I'll be right down. I'm like, okay, I'll hang out. I'm thinking it's Eddie Van Halen. I can't say no, right?
Right.
It's like, oh my God, because I'm sitting there going like, oh geez, I can't believe this is happening, right?
Yeah.
And so I can't believe it. And he made it to my shop and I'm assuming he was home at 5150 or something. So he lived up on Coldwater Canyon on the other side of the hill, like on the valley side.
Mm-hmm.
And how he made it to my shop down on Quanga and Vine I think he made it in probably like half an hour or something. And he kept
Whoa.
screaming. I mean, maybe it's a little longer than that. I don't know. It seemed like he made it really fast considering traffic and everything. He must have driven like a madman. And he comes screaming into my parking spot, and he's got this like it was a Cyclone pickup. I think it was this truck that GMC made back in the day that had a real souped up motor. They were kind of more of a sport pickup. And that thing sounded like it, when he pulled up, I could just tell that he'd just been running it at its ragged edge the whole way over. And he comes popping in. And he was such a nice guy. I mean, I instantly liked him because he was just really energetic and just really like excited about everything. And, and of course I would have loved to have just hung out with him like all afternoon, evening, except that I had somewhere I had to be. So I just quickly sort of showed him the amp, gave him a quick 5-second demo, and kind of just like, here, take this home. I'll talk to you tomorrow kind of deal. Right. And so he grabs the amp, jumps in his truck, flies back home. And I go off and have my lovely dinner and date with my girlfriend and all that kind of stuff. And the next morning, I mean, gosh, it was, I don't even think it was like 10 o'clock. I get this phone call and he's like, oh my God, this thing's great. I love it. Yeah, I got to have this. So how do I pay for it? And blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, I can build you one from scratch. I go, that's just one I keep around for demos. No, I'll take this one. This is great. I love it. So that was his first SLO purchase. That was the first one he bought. And
was it stock?
What's that?
Was it just a regular stock?
Yeah, it was a pretty basic. In fact, you know what? I don't even know if that first one even had an effects loop in it. It may or may not. I can, tell you what. I've found some old archives. I was looking through some stuff for some other reasons the other day, and I found a little stack of receipts that I saved from my first several years in business, and I will find you the invoices for the 3 SLOs that Ed bought from me, and I will email them to you, and you can scan them or do whatever you want, and and you can look at them.
Wow!
But the first one was like, say, February 15th, 1990. I wrote him an invoice, and his manager sent me a check like ASAP, and then he bought a couple others in the next 6 months or so. One was, so that first one I believe is the blue one that you've seen pictures of, kind of that blue ostrich look.
Okay.
And that was just something I had laying around. Like I say, that was kind of more my demo amp, and but he loved it. And so when he called for his second one, he goes, "Give me something really sick looking, something nobody'd like." And so I had this pink ostrich, which was just really annoying looking stuff. And he's like, "Yeah, I want that. That would be really cool." So we made him the pink ostrich one. And I think even my office assistant at the time even wrote on the receipt or something like yuck or something, like she couldn't stand the look of it because it looked like a plucked chicken basically. Oh. And then the last amp we did for him, we got some vinyl paint, and we actually covered the amp in, I believe, white vinyl, and then we masked it off and sprayed it up and made it look like his Frankenstrat. So it's got the the red and black stripes and stuff, and it looked pretty darn cool. So he picked up 3 amps. I think I delivered one of them personally. I'm not sure which one, but he invited me up to 5150, so I got to go up and hang out in the studio, and we just kind of geeked out on gear. He had all this stuff laying around, guitars all half torn apart, and boxes of old pickups and wang bars and stuff, and we just kind of had this total geek fest. And then of course and he was drinking beers and chain smoking the whole time pretty much, and just a really easy guy to hang out with. And he goes, yeah, he says, are you into cars? And I go, yeah, I love cars. And he goes, oh God, he says, let me show you my Lamborghinis. And so we, underneath where the studio part was, he had this really nice built-in underground kind of garage, and he had 3 Lamborghini Miras in there. They were absolutely the most beautiful Italian sports cars I think I'd ever seen. They were just absolutely amazing. And so he showed me those. Then we went down to the house. He had another garage underneath the house, and He had a really nice 56 Chevy Nomad. I think it was a 56, might have been a 55. I can't remember. But anyway, and we just kind of had this real fun hang, and he was just a neat guy to hang out with, and just really unpretentious and really full of life, and it was just really a nice time hanging. And then he also wanted me to retube the Marshall, the one. And so I'm thinking like, oh my God, this is great. I get to see all the mods that were done in this thing. And this is going to be amazing. I'm going to be able to unearth the secrets of the Brown sound and all that crazy stuff. So he hands me the amp and I take it back to my shop. I opened it up. The amp is bone stock. It's just a stock Plexi 100-watt Marshall. And I'm thinking like, wow, that's kind of a trip, So I retubed it. I had some really choice EL34s laying around. So I put in a set of tubes, checked the amp out, make sure everything was good. I took it into my test room, hit a big power cord, and I'm like, oh my God, just about tore my head off. It was so loud. And it was, the typical thing you would expect for any, non-master volume Plexi Marshall. And I was like, wow, I don't hear the Brown sound here. Of course, I don't have Ed's finger, so I'd never hear that sound. But at least tonally, I should be able to kind of hear what that thing was about. And it was not doing it. I'm like, whoa, this is weird. Are these tubes I got too hard? What's the deal? And then I remember, of course, reading, years ago that he always told people he put his amp on a Variac. Well, I kind of figured, well, in some of those earliest Guitar Player magazine interviews, he was saying how he turned the amp up. Well, since then I've learned something, but I'll circle back to that in a second. So he said he'd set the Variac at 140 volts. And I'm like, there's no way he ever did that, because if he did, it would have blown the filter caps right out of the thing and it would have been an instant meltdown. You can't, there's just no way you could do that. So I pulled out my Variac though, and I decided to see what the amp would sound like if I turned it down instead of turning it up. And so I took the Variac into my test room, started turning the voltage down, a little at a time. And when I got down to about 88 volts, that amp just came to life. All of a sudden the volume came down to like a relatively listenable level. So I was able just to crank the volumes all the way up. And that thing compressed and squished down and sounded amazing. And that was the Brown sound. That's how it was done. It was like run the amp down to really lower the plate voltage. And that's where the whole thing starts compressing. And I don't know, at that point with the plate voltage that low, I'm guessing that amp couldn't have been putting out more than about 25, 30 watts or something flat out.
Wow.
And so all of a sudden it became very manageable, and it had all this natural power tube compression. And of course the tubes probably lasted much longer that way because they weren't, just killing themselves, even though they were
just idling.
And they were idling. So the amp sounded killer. And I'm like, there's the secret right there. So that was my experience with the Marshall. Well, then later, in fact, very recently, within the last year or two, I learned that some of his amps were import amps, and they had 220. They were on 220. Well, Marshalls in those years had a selector on the back where you could turn them anyway. And so apparently that whole thing about the 140 volts on the Variac was that he was setting them for European operation, so normally 240 volt, and turning them down to 140, which would be roughly the same as me taking the 120 volt version and turning it down to about 88 or 85 volts. So that's what he was probably doing. He was probably setting the amp in the Euro mode, but at that point, just plugging into 110, the voltage would be so low that the heaters wouldn't get hot enough for the amp to work. So probably he was then putting on a Variac and turning it up to 140, and just enough to get the tubes to turn on, and then away you go and off to the races. So he probably was turning them to 140. What he failed to tell anybody was they were 240 volt amps.
Oh man!
At least that's my theory. I don't know. I can't speak for him.
That sounds like a pretty good theory, man.
That's my theory on the whole thing. So that was the secret. The amps, I mean, maybe he had some other Marshalls that were modified, but I didn't see one. The one I had that he told me was the one that was on those first two albums. No mods in that puppy. But it was sure sounded good when the voltage came down.
So to put this into some context for those that may be watching, by 1990, I mean, let's see, Eric Clapton had been playing your amp. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you had already established your name, and the SLO 100 had pretty much changed your life by 1990. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. So early on, it was slow start, just like any small business. Nobody knew who I was. I came down to LA from Seattle, had this little tiny shop in the middle of nowhere on Melrose, and there wasn't a lot of, there was no internet back then, so there wasn't a way to really get the word out. It was you had to get somehow into that grapevine and have it passed along word of mouth.
Yeah.
And so I basically kind of hung out and starved in my shop for about a year, trying to get word out that I had this amp and stuff. And there was a young guy that had come down to Hollywood to, hang out and be part of the whole scene. A guy from Canada named Tony Antidormi. And he was a very enthusiastic cat. He heard my amps, just thought I was really on the cutting edge of something. And so he asked if he could, be like a sales guy or a rep for me. And I'm like, well, I can't pay you. But if you sell an amp, I'll give you 10%. How's that sound? And he's like, okay, done deal. So he had gone out during that year of my not getting any traction. I'm going out to the clubs at night trying to convince people to try my stuff out. I mean, I did have a little bit of luck when I originally landed in LA. The first week I was in LA, some people I met there invited me to come out to the Rainbow and, experience what the Rainbow is about. And we went and had pizza at the Rainbow. And while I was sitting there having pizza, Howard Leese had walked in, and he was,
wow.
And he sat down at this booth, and he's obviously hanging out, waiting for some friends to show up. And my friends are like, that's Howard Leese. And I go, yeah, I know. That's Howard Leese. And they're like, well, you ought to go talk to him. I go, oh, no, I can't talk to him. He's busy. He's waiting for friends. He doesn't want to be bothered by me. They're like, dude, come on, go over and talk to him. Nobody's here yet. He's just sitting there. And so they literally pushed me out of the booth, because I'm kind of a shy guy. They pushed me out of the booth, and so I wander over and I sit down. And I'm like, hello, Mr. Leese. I'm Mike Soldano. I'm from Seattle, and I make guitar amps. And I thought maybe, I'd just tell you that I was, what I'm up to. And he's like, oh yeah, it sounds great. He says, can I hear one? And I'm like, well, yeah. He goes, well, hey, we're out at Rumbo Recorders tomorrow working on a new record. He says, here's the address. Why don't you bring one out tomorrow morning and let me check it out? So I'm like, oh, hot damn, you betcha. So I only had my personal amp with me, just my main amp.
Yeah.
And so what I did is I just threw that in the trunk of my 38 Chevy, got out my Thomas guide. There was no, Google Maps or anything back then. Got out my Thomas guide, figured out how I was going to get out to this studio out in Canoga Park or wherever it was. I think it was in Canoga Park. Or Thousand Oaks or somewhere, I don't remember now. But anyway, so I drove out there and I showed up. It was my first time even stepping foot in a major recording studio, so that was kind of intimidating in and of itself. But I managed to get him. I found the place. I got inside. Howard came out and says, hey, bring this thing in. So we take it in. He's got his wall of red Marshall cabinets.
Yep.
Pulls down his Marshall head, throws mine up on top, plugs it in, plays it for about 2 minutes, and goes, I've got to have this thing. I'm sold. So Howard, and I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I can sell you my amp. Sure, why not? So, and it was red. I'm sure that didn't hurt,
Yeah.
He goes, well, I don't have my checkbook with me. I'll be right back. So he goes out, jumps in his red Porsche, takes off for Malibu to get his checkbook, and just says, just leaves me kind of hanging
out
in the lounge at Rumbo, So meanwhile, people are walking in, Ann and Nancy walk in, and they introduce themselves. They hang out on the couch with me. We're watching CNN together. They invite me to stay and have barbecue with them for lunch and stuff. And I meet the tour manager and the engineers, and it's really great. And, about an hour and a half later, Howard comes squealing back into the parking lot in his 911, comes walking in, writes me a check, and that was my That was my very first, well, not my first, that was my second SLO sale. The first one I sold to a friend of mine in Seattle before I left town. But
wow.
Anyway, so that's how it kind of got started. But then after that, it was just crickets for about a year. And this guy, Tony, went out and just kept, by that time I built another demo amp.
Mm-hmm.
And Tony would just go out and try to get meetings with anybody he could at any studio. I mean, he was tenacious.
Yeah.
And he finally got one to Lukather and Steve Lukather. So, and Steve bought it on the spot as well. He's like, "You're not even taking this thing home. I'm sending you home with a check. He can't have this amp back. I want it." And so that was kind of the key. When Luke started talking about it, all of a sudden people were listening. And so in that first year, so that was pretty much the fall of, I think that was like the fall of 87. So that was almost 88. And so the word kind of started getting out, but still nothing was really happening. And I was running out of money really quick. So I was really sort of planning on moving back to Seattle after the new year, just because I couldn't keep it going. But when I came back to LA after going home and hanging out with my parents at Christmas, I had a Marshall mod a guy wanted me to do, so I stuck around to do that. And during that time, I got a phone call from some friends of mine that were in this all-girl band named Dixon.
Wow.
And they needed a roadie for a week or so. So I'm like, okay, I'll help you. I had a van. I'll help you haul stuff around. They had some local shows like, Long Beach and whatnot. So I was doing that gig. And during that time, I came home one night from a show that they had done. It was like, and by the time I dropped them off their gear out in the valley, came clear back to Hollywood, it's like 4 a.m. I'm just exhausted. But the light's blinking on my phone machine, and normally I would just be like, yeah, I'll check that tomorrow. I got to hit the sack. I'm tired. But for some reason, I just was drawn to like listening to my messages right then and there at 4 a.m. or whatever it was. And it was amazing because I had a call from, I had a message from Lou Reed, a message from Vivian Campbell, and a message from Michael Landau, all in the same evening. And they all wanted to check out amps. And so, of course, the next morning I woke up and I just had to pinch myself because, like, I must have been hallucinating about those phone calls, but I checked the machine and they were still there. And I'm like, okay, it's like, and then, of course, my first instinct was I thought Andy Brower, who had a studio rental company and always liked to mess with my head, I thought maybe he had called and was just kind of making these calls up and pretending he was, because he would often call and go like, "Oh, this is Bobby at such and such records. We'd like to get an amp from you." And then, he'd just like start cracking up. So at first I was very skeptical. I thought, oh God, Andy got me. So I called him up and started yelling at me because, hey, he says, if those guys, I didn't do that. If you've got Lou Reed's phone number, I suggest you hang up with me right now and call the man and sell him an amp. And so sure enough, I call up and I'm talking to Lou Reed, and then I call up and I'm talking to Adrian Vandenberg, and it's just like, woo, off and running,
Wow.
So anyway, sorry to get so off the track.
No.
You'd asked me more
it's
about it. But anyway, that's what kept me in Hollywood. It's like all of a sudden I'm like, I can build some amps for these guys. And then shortly thereafter, again, probably through Lukather's grapevine, because he was tight with Bradshaw and John Suhr were tight. And John Suhr was on the East Coast building guitars at the time. And Knopfler was playing John's guitars. So I'm sure that's how Mark probably heard about the SLO. But anyway, Mark Knopfler bought some SLOs from me. Or not directly from me. He bought them through a music store in England, I believe. And it was because of him. So by spring of 1988, that's when Clapton came on board. And the reason for that was earlier that year, Knopfler put together the, I believe it was called Farm Aid. It was one of those big giant tours he did.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was Farm Aid. And so his band had Eric Clapton as second guitar player, right? And so they were touring that way. So when that tour was over, Clapton was getting ready to do his tour for that year, his 88 tour.
Mm-hmm.
And so he, reciprocal was to have Mark be in his band as the other guitar
I love
player.
that.
And so they were rehearsing for that. And Mark had his new amps by then. And so I get this call one day from Lee Dixon, heavy English accent. And Lee calls me up and like, oh, hello, I'm Eric Clapton's guitar tech, and we need to get whatever those amps are that Mark has. Eric needs those because he's killing us here, man. It's like Knopfler's tone is just killing Eric's tone, and Eric's got to have whatever his Mark's got. And of course, I was out of parts at the time, so I wasn't able to build the amps immediately. But at the same time, I'm sitting there pinching myself, thinking like, I can't believe this is real. I'm going to be selling some amps to Clapton, because was and still am a huge Clapton fan. And I mean, I could have died that day and been a happy man. This was like something that was beyond my wildest expectations. And so for the beginning of the tour, Eric actually ended up borrowing one of Mark's amps, and they kind of shared gear until I got Eric's built. And then I was able to deliver them to him when he came to LA and got the show on the road.
So a lot of these amps, I have to assume, none of these guys were asking for crazy mods or anything like that. Were they all just primarily just, give me that regular off the shelf SLO 100, just give it to me?
Yeah. The only ones, and I made a mistake earlier on. I said that I'd gotten a call from Adrian Vanberg. That actually came later. It was Vivian Campbell I was talking to with those 3 phone calls, the Lou Reed, Vivian, and Michael Landau. I just got a little confused there. It's been quite a few years since then.
It has been a long time.
the only custom request I had early on was from Vivian Campbell, and that was he wanted his amps to be rack mounted. So up to that point, they were all heads, and he wanted rack mount. So I literally did a crash design on figuring out a way to package it into a rack mount chassis, and designed a rack mount chassis in like record time. I mean, I worked around the clock, and you got to remember in those days, there was no CAD drawing. I was drawing everything by hand, with pencil and paper on drafting paper. I had a drafting board and a square and all that stuff. So I was cranking out all these sheet metal drawings and then running around LA trying to find a sheet metal shop that could make me the parts to build those first rack chassis. So the only special request I had in those for quite a long time was just that rack mount chassis, which of course I then ended up putting that into production as a production amp as well. But other than that, tonally, they just loved them the way they were. I didn't do any real tweaking until a bit later. And probably one of the first tweaks was when Warren Haynes, who at the time was playing with the Allman Brothers, now of course he has his solo career, when he got his SLO, he has a way of playing where he of course obviously uses the overdrive channel, but he runs the volume really low, or not volume, but the gain really low. And the way I originally designed that amp was, in those days, a lot of the pickup manufacturers were building really high output pickups to make up for the fact that amps in those days prior to mine didn't really have any gain.
Right.
So DiMarzio had, I believe it was called the X2N.
Yep.
Seymour Duncan had the Invader. But these were all pickups that had huge magnets and a ton of wire on them.
Yeah.
And so what happens is when you start wrapping a lot of wire around a pickup, you start getting a lot of what they call induction, and that takes away high end. So all of a sudden the pickups just get darker and darker sounding. And so the higher the output of the pickup, generally speaking, the darker it's going to sound. So I kind of had this idea when I designed the SLO was that I would build in an automatic compensation in the gain control so that when you turn the gain down, the amp would actually get brighter to kind of help compensate for those high output pickups, because you didn't need a lot of gain with those pickups, but you did need to kind of help the high end. So I figured if you turn the gain down for a hot pickup, it'll brighten it. And if you turn the gain up For a single coil, it'll take away that high end because you don't need any high end, but you do need gain to get signal out of the single coil pickup. And it works 99.9% of the time for most players. However, if you use a low output, fairly bright pickup and then turn the gain down, it can tend to be a little bright sounding because now you're taking an already bright pickup and you're adding some brightness to it. And so Warren was playing Les Pauls that had original PAFs in them, which are beautiful sounding pickups, but they're very low output.
Yes.
And they're pretty, they got nice, clean, beautiful high
bright.
end.
Yeah.
But when you turn the gain way down, they can be a little bit shrill.
Yeah.
So the first mod we did was called the Warren Haynes mod, which was basically taking and switching out that capacitor that added that extra brightness when you turn the gain down and just making it dead flat all the way from 0 to 11 on the gain spectrum. And that was like one of the first requests. And then from there on, we just started
depth mods, and there was all sorts of stuff.
All kinds of stuff, yeah. But for all those early users, they were just happy with the amp straight out of the box. And the only option I really offered that was at that time optional, now is a standard, was the effects loop, because a lot of the early amps, people were still doing slaving. And so with slaving, they didn't really need a loop. They just needed a slave out. So the amps came with a slave out. The loop was an option. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Wow. What a trip down memory lane. So
oh, well, yeah, really. God, I don't know. I'm starting to realize there's some cobwebs starting to grow up there. So
and
if I make little mistakes, I will have to fix them.
And I will be sure to flash all sorts of vintage pictures of you. I believe there's one of you on a Yamaha amp, crouching, leather jacket.
Yeah.
I mean, you were very 80s and
yeah,
LA.
I had hair back then.
And I love that you just basically left Seattle, built just a tone empire, and then you came back to Seattle, which you came back in Seattle, what, mid-90s?
Yeah, like 94 basically. My little sister was starting to raise a family, and I wanted to see my niece and nephew grow up. And I figured I'd done everything I needed to do in Hollywood and LA. I mean, I wasn't in Hollywood the whole time. I'd moved out to the Valley eventually because I needed more manufacturing space. But I figured I did everything I needed to do in LA, and the traffic was kind of starting to get to me. And again, like I said, I wanted to see my sister's family grow up. So I moved back to Seattle, brought the whole dog and pony show with me, and established myself in Ballard, which is a nice neighborhood in Seattle, and I had a nice shop, and now spent a good length of time there, and then now I'm retired and living in Tacoma, just a few miles south of Seattle.
Amazing. Well, I think it looks like you have a lot of books to read behind you. I don't want to take up.
I do.
I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to thank you so much for hanging out and kind of just reminiscing about the old days. And I think this has been a really fun hang. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Thank you, Fluff. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Man.